Hello, welcome. This is the Alexander Library. My name is Liz Beasley. I'm the director of the New Brunswick Summer and Special Projects for the Division of Continuing Studies, and we're delighted to host this faculty author event in partnership with the Rutgers University Libraries, who are our hosts here today. We'll hear today from David Greenberg, professor of history and of journalism and of media studies here at Rutgers. Specializing in American political and cultural history, David is a frequent commentator in the national news media on contemporary politics and public affairs. David's also a recipient of the Rutgers University Board of Trustees Research Fellowship for Scholarly Excellence, and author of numerous prize-winning books, including Nixons Shadow, The History of an Image, which was awarded the Washington Monthly Annual Political Book Award, the American Journalism History Award, and Columbia University's Bancroft Dissertation Award. Formerly a full-time journalist, he served as managing editor and acting editor of The New Republic, where he was a contributing editor until 2014. He has been a regular contributor to Slate since its founding and has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and other scholarly and popular publications. He graduated from Yale and earned his PhD at Columbia. Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, David's newest book and the topic of today's talk, has been described as utterly engrossing and deeply authoritative, and everything a political history should be: vivid, comprehensive, and important. Before David takes the mic, please bear with me for just a few housekeeping items. First, be sure to put any phones or devices on silent to limit disruptions during the talk. Second, David's presentation will be followed by a brief question and answer period. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, but please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. Third, this event is being video recorded by RUTV for their At the Podium series and will be broadcast and made publicly available on the internet. If you decide to make a comment or to participate in the Q&A, it may be included in this recording. Following the Q&A, 10 copies of Republic of Spin will be raffled away to the audience, so stick around. The Rutgers University Bookstore is also on hand to sell copies of David's book if you are not lucky enough to win a free copy. Lastly, be sure to save the date for a final author talk this summer. On July 27, we will host Janet Brennan Croft, author of Perilous and Fair, Women in the Works and Lives of J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm sure you'll enjoy that as well. Thank you, and help me welcome Dr. Greenberg, and we'll listen to him.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Matt. I want to thank everyone at Alexander Library for arranging this. My offices, since I'm based at Sky, are right nearby, so this is really a kind of second home for me, the building. I'm just a few yards away and always cutting across the grass to come here. So it's especially nice to have you all as an audience today. I really want to talk mainly about the book and sort of tell you what the book is about, how I came to write it, and what some of my conclusions were in the course of researching it. It's not my first book. Liz mentioned my first book, Nixons Shadow, The History of an Image. And I thought I would just say a word about that book because in my research for that book many years ago now really were the seeds for this project, which is much more recently completed. Nixons Shadow was not a biography of Nixon, but a history of what Nixon symbolized to the American people. It was the story not of what Nixon did so much as of what Nixon meant. And in the course of examining all the different understandings and depictions and images of Nixon, I came to see a kind of recurring theme in the criticisms of Nixon, in the Nixon hatred that was such a strong sentiment throughout so much of 20th century political life, as I'm sure many of you know. And one theme of the Nixon hatred, one theme in that critique, was that Nixon was somehow an especially inauthentic figure, that he was as a lot of the book titles and commentary had, a man wearing a mask. The Nixon Mask is, in fact, an artifact that pops up everywhere. And there are book titles like Nixon, the Man Nobody Knows, or Nixon, the Man Behind the Mask. And I came to see that this spoke to a certain concern that Nixon provoked in people, that our politics, our democracy might, in the age of mass media, be manipulated, that we might be getting politicians who pretended to be one thing while really being something else, and that the technology afforded by mass media and modern psychology and by our mass society in general made the public especially vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. Now, on concluding Nixon's Shadow, I came to see that while Nixon was an especially good exemplar of these anxieties that Americans in the 20th century had about their democracy, he did not originate them, that these concerns actually went back further. And I sort of took it as my mission to try to understand a deeper, long-running criticism of American politics that I saw going back, if not to the very beginning, certainly to the start of the 20th century. And I am not going to do a lot of reading today, but I want to read just a passage from the first page of the new book that I think gives a flavor of what this widespread anxiety of our politics conveys. Our political world is awash in spin. Over many decades now, elected officials and their aides have forged a huge arsenal of tools and techniques to shape their messages, their images, and our thinking. From the White House on down, virtually every politician of note boasts a brigade of speechwriters, press secretaries, campaign consultants, media gurus, handlers, pollsters, hucksters, flacks, hacks, and other assorted spinmeisters to ensure that each utterance and pose is rendered in the best achievable light. Sometimes our politics seem to be nothing but spin, a dizzying, cacophonous whirl of claims and counterclaims. Each side charges the other with spin while asserting for itself a purchase on the truth. The growth of spin has given rise to a series of now familiar complaints. We hear that our politics are phony and corrupt, that our leaders are packaged and unprincipled, that their rhetoric is shallow and poll-tested, that even the most important political events, debates, conventions, speeches, interviews, press briefings, are scripted, staged, and choreographed. And it's those complaints about spin and about our politics more generally that really, as much as the art of spin itself, are the subject of this book. And I decided I wanted to try to understand where this came from. And as I sort of surveyed the literature, I saw that there were lots of books and articles about individual chapters or periods in our history and the relationship between politics and PR, but nobody had really written a comprehensive history of the White House spin machine. And that's really what I've set out to do in this book. Now, within that story, as I've suggested, there's more than one narrative thread. And what I want to do in my remarks today is outline basically the three separate narratives that I have tried to weave together into a coherent whole. The first is, of course, about the presidents themselves. I call it an inside history of the American presidency, and how they have used the tools and techniques of spin over the last 100 or so years. Then, secondarily, there are the spin doctors, their story, the aides, the consultants, and spinmeisters that I just listed, who assisted the presidents both en route to the presidency as campaign aides and then once in the White House. And then finally, and to me most intriguingly, is a third story of the critics, the intellectuals, the writers, the journalists, who observed this emerging world of spin and at each turn commented on it, critiqued it, in some cases enthusiastically supporting it, in other cases worrying about its implication for democracy. And so I want to say a bit about each of these three groups this afternoon. So first, let's start with the presidents. There, my story begins with Theodore Roosevelt. That's not because I think presidents before Theodore Roosevelt didn't care about their image or didn't care about reaching public opinion. Of course they did. All politicians have, really, from time immemorial. And I'll say a little bit about the ancient Greeks and their concern with rhetoric and argument later in my talk. But I think Theodore Roosevelt is significant because he really transformed what the American presidency was. When he came into office, there was really none of this apparatus that I just described. There was no White House communications office, no press secretary. There was really no one working for him who could be enjoined to persuade the public about his arguments, to tend to his image. And yet he wanted to make the presidency something different. In the 19th century, Congress really drove the action. If you were a reporter in Washington, you didn't go to the White House to cover the news because there was no White House press room. There was no White House press secretary. You went to Congress where the galleries were there for the press, and that's where the action was, and that's what was reported in the next day's paper. But after the Industrial Revolution, after the Gilded Age, a lot of progressives came to see that America's new social and economic needs were not being met by Congress, and it required a stronger federal hand, particularly a stronger executive, in order to sort of break the logjam, in order to get things done. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was a doer and an activist by nature, saw the presidency as the vehicle for getting these reforms put in place. So how would he get these reforms put in place? By turning to this newly powerful force of public opinion. We had a much bigger middle class, a more literate public, a more politically engaged public. And he figured, as president, he wanted to reach these people, the broad masses, get them on his side, and use the power of public opinion in a democracy to push through his agenda of reform. So to do that, he instituted a whole range of new innovations. He toured widely. Not too many presidents in the 19th century had done this very often. He would get on the train, go out west, go down south, talk in town after town, giving speeches on behalf of legislation that he supported, whether it was reforming the railroads or the meatpacking industry or various other industrial reforms that he saw as necessary to a more just society. He hired the first government information officers, the first press officers, to handle the flood of interest in projects like the Panama Canal. Now, Congress always resisted. Why did we need a paid propagandist to sort of handle these press inquiries? Wasn't this just shoring up the power of the presidency at the expense of Congress? And to some degree it was. But Roosevelt hired a number of figures to help him manage the press as that became a greater demand. He staged really the first presidential publicity stunts. He would do things like ride 94 miles on horseback in order to demonstrate what he thought was the reasonableness of new Army regulations that he proposed. After all, if the president could perform this feat, so could any Army grunt. These kinds of stunts were much more likely to get him on the front page than simply giving a speech or simply submitting to Congress a proposal. And then finally, and I want to read a short passage about this too, he really pioneered the presidential press conference, which in his hands became something truly memorable for the growing ranks of White House reporters. Most heady of all were Roosevelt's informal news conferences, the first held by a president. TR would ask 5 or 6 reporters, his, quote, newspaper cabinet, as he called them, or the fair-haired, as others said with derision, to join him in the afternoon in a small room next to his office. There, a Treasury Department messenger who moonlighted as the barber-in-chief, would groom Roosevelt as he held forth on politics, policy, and gossip. Frequently, in mid-shave, the excitable president would bound out of his armchair, lather flying off his face, to lecture the newsmen on a particular issue. Walter Clark of the New York Sun, writing to a colleague about his, quote, bully-long confab with Teddy, gushed, "I wish I had time to tell you all the funny things he said. He talked a blue streak even while the barber was shaving him." Barely able to squeeze in a word, let alone a question, the journalists devised stratagems to assert themselves. Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker who often attended these sessions, would let Roosevelt ramble until the barber's razor just skimmed his lower lip, forcing it shut. Then the journalist would fire off his most insolent queries as the president, wriggling in his chair, would be stilled by the barber's admonition, "Steady, Mr. President." "A more skillful barber never existed," declared Louis Brownlow, a young reporter who would later work for FDR. So here I've gone on at some length about Theodore Roosevelt because of the sheer innovation of his presidency, the way he went from 0 to 60 in terms of news management and new practices, new institutions, new tools and techniques that were soon to become staples of the presidential arsenal. But he's far from alone among the presidents I discuss, and in fact, I discuss almost every one of his successors, all of whom in some way or other made contributions to the development of White House spin. So for example, the book will take you to Woodrow Wilson deciding to make the State of the Union address a visual spectacle where he goes up to Capitol Hill, speaks before the joint session of Congress with newspaper reporters in tow. For the previous 100 years, that State of the Union message, which today has become a kind of cast of thousands spectacle, but for years it was just a written message that was sent up quietly to the Hill, very little fanfare. Maybe it covered in the papers, but was not the grand spectacle that Woodrow Wilson made it out to be. Even some presidents who we don't think of as great innovators with media actually did make their contributions. Herbert Hoover, for example. Herbert Hoover really pioneered the campaign film, and you can find one of them on YouTube called Master of Emergencies. And during 1928, Hoover was Commerce Secretary and was running for president, had the Republican nomination. And he, as Commerce Secretary, had been sent to the Mississippi region after the 1927 flood, which was the worst natural disaster that America had experienced to that time and remained so until Hurricane Katrina. And there the sort of newsreel footage shows Hoover, feeding bedraggled children and pulling horses out of the river and really showing him as this kind of Superman. He had also fed Europe after World War I. He was really seen as a kind of technocrat who could solve these problems. Of course, as you all know, soon as president, Herbert Hoover would face his own emergency and would not prove to be such a master. But in 1928, that film certainly gave people reason to believe that he would be able to tackle just about any problem. There are all kinds of innovations, some with technology, some with psychological explorations. Perhaps the most important but understudied are those kinds of bureaucratic innovations. One of the most interesting ones came during the Vietnam War when Lyndon Johnson puts together what's called the Vietnam Information Group, the first interagency organization assembled to help sell the public on the war. This was at a time when, after initial support, public enthusiasm for the Vietnam War was flagging. And so in the White House, they thought it necessary to bring together all of the information officers, of whom there had been none under TR, but now they had them in the Defense Department, the State Department, in the White House, get them together for a weekly messaging meeting so that everybody would be on the same page, issuing the same talking points, getting out there on the television programs and talking to reporters with the same constant message. And this, of course, is an MO that we know well today. In fact, when the Bush administration was ramping up its plans to go into Iraq, they had their own White House information group that devised its own talking points, like, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, if you remember that warning about Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction. So those kinds of bureaucratic innovations are in some ways just as important as FDR's mastery of radio or what have you. And then I continue the story really up to the present, talking about Barack Obama with the first ever White House videographer and the first ever White House Twitter feeds. So that's the story of the presidents. Now, it's kind of just a skeleton of the story, because the other key characters who make this spin machine grow are what I'm calling the spin doctors, those who have assisted the presidents at every step of the way. And going back to Theodore Roosevelt, there were always these experts, some from journalism, some from advertising, some from public relations, some coming out of political consulting itself, once that became a field unto its own. And they, too, have an important role to play in this story. Some of them are people you've probably heard of. You know, recently, people like Karl Rove or David Axelrod, or going back just a little further, Michael Deaver, Ronald Reagan's image impresario, who helped Reagan come up with the choice image for each nightly news segment each day. But then there are a lot of these figures who really have been lost to history. And it actually sort of gave me a sense that I was onto something with this book when I would mention some of these characters to historians and political scientists, and people would often turn up with a shrug, not knowing who these very important figures were. So I want to just give you a few examples. One of the more interesting gentlemen I encountered was Judson Welliver. Judson Welliver actually has a society named after him. It's the Society of Former White House Speechwriters, because he gets credit as the first ever White House speechwriter. Welliver actually did not use the title. The title was not, the office of speechwriting was not in place till Eisenhower's administration. But under Warren Harding in the 1920s, the White House recognized that the president needed help. That now the president was after Teddy Roosevelt, after Woodrow Wilson, who were both really spectacular orators. The president was being expected to make many, many more public remarks. There was just a greater demand on his voice and his pen. But Warren Harding was not much of a speaker. In fact, he was known to be a horrendous speech maker, known for his bloviating style. And in fact, I believe the word bloviating was coined in order to describe a Warren Harding speech. H.L. Mencken, the great political commentator and satirist, talked about Harding's speech, and he described his inaugural address memorably as stale bean soup and dogs barking at the laundry line. So Judson Welliver was brought in. His title was literary clerk, and he was assigned, to write a lot of these perfunctory remarks that the president now had to give, and even to sort of help with the more substantive addresses. And soon, by the end, even H.L. Mencken was writing in his columns, Harding's speech making is improving. I think we can give credit to old Welliver. Another fascinating figure from the spin doctors is a man named Robert Montgomery, who sort of perhaps a few of the older folks may remember from the Eisenhower years. He's actually, these days, I think, best known from my generation for his bewitching young daughter, Elizabeth Montgomery. But Robert was himself a movie actor and director and producer who his career sort of paralleled Ronald Reagan's in a bit. After World War II, found the movie opportunities drying up, moved into the new medium of television, and had a weekly series, Robert Montgomery Presents. He was also, like Reagan, a Republican and interested in politics. And during the 1952 presidential campaign, he watched Dwight Eisenhower's television debut, when he basically announced his candidacy. And it was a disaster. Eisenhower was giving a speech from his hometown of Abilene, Kansas, from a baseball field, but there was a huge downpour. The bleachers behind him emptied out, and so on screen you saw people like scurrying back and forth behind him as if nothing important was happening. Eisenhower was in a raincoat instead of his usual smart army uniform. His glasses fogged up so he couldn't read his speech. So Montgomery puts in an emergency phone call, as he describes it. Well, several months later, once Eisenhower is elected, Montgomery is summoned to the White House for a consultation, and soon he's hired as the first ever permanent White House TV coach with his own office in the West Wing. And Montgomery did all kinds of things to work with Eisenhower. He vetted the speeches, he read them over to make sure they would be paced well for television, but he did things like putting Eisenhower in light blue suits, replacing his glasses with lighter lucite frames that would look better on TV. He had Eisenhower sometimes come out in front of the desk in the Oval Office and maybe sort of relax this way. All kinds of ways to try to make Eisenhower a little more appealing. Here was a man, after all, who was born in 1890, not a creature of the modern technology age. And yet, by the end of Eisenhower's administration, he really was a successful television president. We remember JFK as the first TV president. But it's Eisenhower who, in the late 50s, toward the end of his second term, gives the speech about Sputnik when the Russians launched the first satellite. Eisenhower gives a very effective address from the Oval Office. He gives the very effective speech about the Little Rock integration crisis when black students are trying to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And these sort of help establish that primetime Oval Office address as kind of the form of presidential communication for the president to put his message across and reach really the entire American public, something that in recent years has become increasingly hard for presidents to do because news has been shunted to the cable channels and there just isn't that same ability to kind of commandeer all the networks to put your message across. The final character I want to mention from these spin doctors is another person that almost nobody seems to have heard of yet played a really fundamental role in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, named Emil Huriya. Emil Huriya was a Finnish-American geologist from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan who made his way around the West in Alaska and Montana, eventually down to Texas, worked in the oil industry, really with an interest in mining and the extractive industries, but he was also a real political buff. And he applied some of his knowledge of rocks and geology and mining to the study of public opinion. And this was at a time when public opinion polling was quite crude. And Huriya understood, as he said, that you can't, that what the pollsters or what the magazines that people relied on for polling were doing, which was to sort of send out mailers and then take back what you get and count up, the guesses as to who's going to be elected president, that was like skimming the surface of a rock to take its chemical content. You had to pulverize the rock and take a true cross-section, and that's also what you had to do with public opinion. So even though he wasn't a pollster himself, he would aggregate all the numbers, and then he would study who was responding to these surveys, what kinds of people, and try to match it against the population that it was trying to assess. And through that recalibration, he was able to get much more accurate assessments of what the public really thought. So armed with this technique, he goes into the offices of the Democratic National Committee saying how he can help the party. He's promptly judged a crackpot and thrown out. But 4 years later, when FDR is running in 1932, there's a new Democratic chairman named James Farley, who's Roosevelt's guy, who decides he'll give Huriya a chance, unpaid. And throughout the fall, he's continually amazed at Huriya's prescience. He starts allowing him to write the press releases. And then when FDR wins in a landslide, he's brought on to the team. 2 years later, it's 1934, the off-year elections. Typically, during the off-year elections, as you may know, the party in the White House loses seats in Congress. That's just sort of the natural rhythm of things. And yet, Huriya is put back on the task, and he's predicting, no, the Democrats are going to pick up seats. Well, when November rolls around, it turns out that, lo and behold, Huriya was correct. So I want to read just a short passage about the aftermath of that accurate prediction. So this was, for the first time since 1902, the president's party picked up seats in the midterms. Washington wise men were floored. I will never question another election prediction of Emil Huriya's, vowed Raymond Clapper, a columnist for the Washington Post. The president told James Farley that Huriya's spot-on forecast was, quote, the most remarkable thing he had ever seen in politics. Huriya made the cover of Time magazine. Again, first presidential pollster, cover of Time magazine, all but forgotten today, and was profiled in other magazines. He and his wife took to the social life of the Capitol, entertaining diplomats, Supreme Court justices, and congressmen at their yellow brick Georgetown manse. They sailed to Europe on the Queen Mary for the coronation of George VI. Reporters dropped by Huriya's backroom office at Democratic headquarters, describing for their readers a gallimaufry of binders, maps, charts, newspaper clippings, almanacs, legislative reports, slide rules, adding machines, books of logarithms, colored crayons, and index cards, analyzing political behavior in every state, county, and city in America. Quote, he would strew maps on the floor and look at them all day, said one visitor. Then he would play with the calculating machines and with a pencil and pad. Finally, he would come up with the information that it was necessary to concentrate speakers and propaganda in certain counties of a state in order to win. The press painted him as no more partisan or irrational than a machine. Quote, his method, wrote Time magazine, is simply to avoid opinion and stick to statistical fact. And when the book came out a couple months ago, I ran an excerpt in Politico magazine focusing on Huriya, and they gave it the headline, FDR's Nate Silver. And I think there really are parallels between the way Nate Silver, for those of you who follow his blog or webpage on 538, it's called, he really is not a pollster himself, but tries to use all the existing information, burrow down deep, and make better predictions. So that's the story of the spin doctors, or some of the stories. There's many more coming up to the present day. The third story, which in some ways, to me, is the most interesting, is the intellectual history component of this book. The story of the writers and intellectuals who argued about spin, who analyzed spin, and these different tools and techniques as they were being developed. Some of these people were great optimists about what these new innovations might portend for democracy. John Dewey, the philosopher, for example, was a big believer in radio and thought radio might help recreate a kind of town hall style democracy, even amid the kind of sprawling mass society that had emerged by the 20s and 30s. There were critics. I write a lot about Vance Packard, the journalist whose 1957 bestseller, The Hidden Persuaders, is known for its critique of commercial advertising on television, but also has a very significant chapter on politics and the way that politics in the television age was making use of psychological insights to try to get people to vote in ways that they themselves perhaps didn't fully rationally understand. To Packard and to many people like them, and I think there's a long tradition here, there was a fear of a loss of autonomy even, that the kind of Enlightenment idea of, liberal democracy based on people voting their own self-interest after reason and reflection was imperiled by television, by the psychological tricks that these advertising hucksters were developing. And then between the optimists and these pessimists, there's a third category who I think of as the realists. And in a way, I don't say this explicitly in the book, but I think of them as kind of the silent heroes of the book. These are the people who saw some of the problems with the emerging spin and the emerging culture of media politics, And yet, rather than throwing up their hands or engaging in the kind of Jeremiads of Vance Packard, took it upon themselves to try to educate the public and saw that a better public understanding of how politics worked might help us retain a robust democracy in which all kinds of opinions and arguments were entertained. So these include people like Walter Lippmann in the 1920s, Archibald MacLeish in the 1940s, people like Theodore White, the great chronicler of the campaigns, who's starting with the 1960 campaign, makes it his mission to take people behind the scenes to see how the strategy is mapped out, to see the story behind the story. And including, somewhat improbably, I have a section on the German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt, who I've been thinking a lot lately, the research I did on her for this book, because she wrote about lying in politics. And what she came to say about lying in politics in some ways reflects where I ultimately came down on spin in politics. And she said, I'm forgetting the exact quote, but something to the effect of, since when have politics and the truth ever been happy bedfellows? That is to say, this has always been a part of politics, and we have never really expected the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth from our politicians. There are places, the seminar room, the courtroom, the science laboratory, where we do want unvarnished truth, and that we want those people to be truth tellers with a capital T. But that's not really what we want from politicians. Politics has to have room for give and take, even for sort of fudging around the edges. Yes, if there's kind of egregious lying, it should be called out. She was actually motivated to write the essay because of her frustration and her rage at Lyndon Johnson and the lies that he told about the Vietnam War. But she didn't want to take a moralistic approach and try to banish it from the kingdom of politics. And so I think Arendt's position leads me into a nice place to kind of make a few final points that I came to conclude after the many years of research I spent on this book. And the first is kind of implicit in that discussion of Arendt, that spin is not all bad, right? The name spin comes from the 1980s. After the presidential debates, the surrogates for the candidates would convene in what was called Spin Alley. Now there are so many of these people, they call it the spin room. They had to expand. Spin Alley, spin room. And these surrogates would talk to the television reporters, giving remarks about why their man had won that were, completely insincere. In fact, may have even been written before the debate began. And yet the reporters interview them anyway, knowing that what they're getting is spin. And then we, as the audience, watch the reporters knowing, interviewing the surrogates who are knowing that this is all spin. And yet we do so, and sometimes, at least speaking for myself, we can even enjoy that, right? We're not being fooled when we hear the other side saying why, Ted Cruz won this debate or Marco Rubio won the debate. We're capable of making our own judgments, and yet we're curious to see how the spin plays out. So the word spin, which is really a kind of modern day synonym for what used to be called publicity or propaganda, to me has a playful ring to it. Unlike propaganda, which implies messages kind of being forced on a passive public, spin suggests we're in on the game, that we can see through it, we can critique it, we can even applaud it if it's something that we agree with. And I think there really are two sides then of spin. To go back, I mentioned earlier the ancient Greeks who talked and argued about rhetoric. So Plato, who wrote about rhetoric, thought all rhetoric was to be deplored, because the rhetoric that the orators used in the agora and the town square, the purpose was not to bring the assembled public to reach the truth. It was just to induce conviction. It could be conviction about something true or conviction about something false. But you measured the skill of an orator. You measured the rhetoric by how good they were at persuading you of whether it was true or false. And he thought this was wrong, this was bad, because the purpose should only be to get you to truth. That's what philosophy does. So for him, rhetoric was a pale imitation of philosophy, much the way he thought cosmetics were a sort of debased form of medicine. Medicine made you healthy. You know, cosmetics could make you look healthy. And that's how he saw all rhetoric. Aristotle comes along, Plato's student, but has a very different view, says, no, that's silly to say that all rhetoric is sort of disqualified. It's a tool of leadership. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill, depending on the character of the person using it and the purposes for which it's put. And I think today we fancy ourselves Platonists, you know, deploring spin at every turn, but deep down we're really Aristotelians. We're able to see through spin. We're able to critique it when it's you know, not along the lines we like. So spin is not all bad. In addition, spin is not all new, as I hinted by saying it goes back to the Greeks and back to Theodore Roosevelt. And then the third and final point is that spin, for all that, is not all powerful. What was as striking to me in writing this book as the cases of effective spin were the cases where spin ran up against limits of persuasion. Presidents found themselves frustrated that they couldn't move the public, or that their spin was met with counterspin. And in an open society, in a democracy, there is going to be counterspin. The president is going to put forward one set of arguments, Congress will put forward another. One party advances its case, the opposing party advances its case. And above all, a lot of the mid-century social scientists, and this is now kind of coming into vogue again in the realm of social sciences, came to see that it's much harder to persuade people of things that they don't already believe. We have natural tendencies, we have our attachments, our belief systems, and in order to sort of wean us from those, it really takes an overwhelming degree of evidence and sort of countervailing argument. And in fact, typically when people feel strongly about something, they react to countervailing evidence by feeling it more strongly. They kind of dig in their heels, as it were, intellectually and redouble their beliefs. So spin is not new, spin is not all powerful, and spin is not all bad. A final story sort of that might illustrate this comes from our current president, Barack Obama. In 2008, he ran, as did his counterpart, John McCain, very much against spin, taking that Platonic mode, denouncing spin. He goes on Larry King Live at one point and says, what Washington needs is more straight talk. That was McCain's phrase, but Obama appropriates it. More straight talk and less spin. Well, 2 years later, Obama has his own midterm elections, and unlike FDR, the Democrats don't do so well. In fact, they take what Obama calls a shellacking. And he's asked by Peter Baker of the New York Times, what happened? What went wrong? And he says, well, you know, I think our policies were fine. There was no problem with the policies. But I really didn't pay enough attention to the PR and the marketing and the selling of those policies. In other words, the Obama of 2008 had said we need less spin, but here was the Obama of 2010 saying we need more spin. And again, I think it's that ambivalence that we all have, the Platonic and the Aristotelian. And I think it's born from an understanding, and this is kind of where the note on which I end the book, that we all have seen in recent years episodes where spin is used for misleading. But we often forget that spin is also used for leading. And it's that dual nature of spin, for leading and for misleading, that I think induces a lot of this anxiety in our culture about the rhetoric and the mass communications and these new tools and techniques that have been developed over the last century to try to shape public opinion. So I'll conclude my remarks there. and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you. He made similar remarks quite recently about some of his failures or shortcomings too. And I've noticed sort of throughout history, politicians frequently resort to this explanation, excuse, if you will, of why they didn't prevail. And I do think, whether consciously or unconsciously, there's something comforting about telling oneself, our side didn't lose the battle of ideas. We didn't lose the political fight. We just lost in this kind of grubbier, realm, less significant realm of communication than persuasion, as if this isn't itself a fundamentally important part of politics. So Obama's hardly alone. You go back to Theodore Roosevelt. At one point, I have a scene in the book where Pitchfork Ben Tillman, Democratic senator who hated TR, rises up on the Senate floor and gives this 2.5-hour speech denouncing the president, saying he owes all of his success to, in effect, spin. He didn't use the word then, but to courting the media, courting the press, confusing the people. And it is kind of the crutch, the consolation that I think people fall upon when they have, on a short term at least, lost the battle for public opinion.
Could you comment on how our early presidents used not their staff but friends and family to get their message out or to spin their message?
Well, I mean, from the earliest days, I mean, when you say our early presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Adams. I mean, there's always a kind of apparatus around the president that's there to put out the message. Usually in the early republic, it takes the form of writing letters, columns in the newspapers. So, you have sometimes writing under pen names, anonymously. You see family members. John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, would often take up a defense of his father in a Boston paper or something like that. So that practice was around. Andrew Jackson had a great newspaper going, the Washington National, I think it was called, that was really known to be this, it was like kind of the first full-on organ of the presidency designed for presidential propaganda. So in that sense, it really, this goes back even before TR. But in those days, the newspapers reached such a small slice of the public. I mean, perhaps you could call it public opinion, but it wasn't until you really had the mass society of the late 19th, early 20th century that this big, fight for these dominant storylines, dominant narratives and images becomes something resembling what we have today.
How does that weigh against the effectiveness of spin? That is, isn't there an interaction that says?
Yeah, I think that's a good insight. It also, however, can work the other way, right? So if we sort of accept what the president is saying and who he's presenting himself as, we're more likely to call him authentic. I mean, what I found in some of the research here is that the notion of who's authentic and who's not, it may be something we think we can kind of judge pretty easily. Here's Bernie Sanders, who looks like he just rolled out of bed and gave a speech, and like that's authentic, or Trump, who says whatever pops into his head, is authentic, and Hillary Clinton or Mitt Romney or John Kerry, these kind of more guarded people, are inauthentic. But you start to pick it apart, it comes apart. I mean, Sanders with his system is rigged message, this is something I was, about 18 months ago, long before he sort of launched his campaign, I had the privilege of being at a White House strategy session for the State of the Union for Obama, where they called in a number of academics and consultants. And one guy gets the floor and starts telling the president's aides, Obama wasn't there himself, but Dennis McDonough and some of these guys, your State of the Union has to focus on the system is rigged, that's going to, and they're like, oh, and it was Tad Devine, who's basically the mastermind of the Sanders campaign. So they said, save that for the Sanders campaign. So this is a line that Sanders came up with one of the most experienced, expensive consultants in Washington, that, yeah, I'm sure he believes it, but there's a craft and a, or to give another great example, in 1948, Harry Truman was running for election in his own right for the first time. He had inherited the presidency when FDR died, and he was considered, unlike FDR, to be not such a good communicator. But he comes out at the Democratic Convention in 1948 with this kind of ad-lib style, and he's kind of swaying on the balls of his feet, and he's talking from notes, and gives this wonderful address that's just rapturously reviewed, and people love the extemporaneous style, the ad-lib. Well, it turned out that for 3 or 4 months, he'd been working in the studio with Leonard Reince, a radio coach, to perfect this ad-lib style, and he practiced it in some earlier speeches that spring, and it had gone well. Now, Harry Truman was certainly authentic. He was a guy, he had a salty style and a shoot from the hip demeanor, and that, that was all real, but there was also a lot of calculation in his self-presentation. And so, anyway, some of what we judge to be authentic can simply reflect just our own emotional connection to these people and the way they resonate with us, rather than how sincere, or true, or honest they actually are. Yeah.
Thanks for taking my question.
Sure.
This is very interesting. I was wondering whether you came across in your research whether the level of spin corresponded with the intellectual or political savviness of the public at the time.
Well, it's interesting because I see it as a bit of an arms race. That is, politicians develop more sophisticated methods of spin. The public, not to a person, but overall tends to kind of catch on. And that forces the politicians to innovate further. So just to take one example, when television ads start for the campaign, they're very simple affairs. And within a few years, they're just seen as kind of hopelessly outdated, so they have to devise new methods. So at one point, in the 60s, it becomes common to have like the man on the street interview. And these people come up and start talking about why they like this candidate and why he'd be so good. And you think, oh, these are like actual citizens. And then, of course, in time, people realize these are people like picked by the campaign to say this. And those kinds of ads start to lose their effectiveness because the conceit becomes widely known. So the savviness of the public kind of, it's not always directly keeping pace, but it kind of improves as the politicians' methods improve. And so there's a kind of arms race or cat and mouse game, I think.
I was wondering whether in Europe, here.
Yeah, I don't have much about the European experience at all in this book. It's a history of the U.S. But, I do look a little bit at, 1930s Germany, where obviously propaganda is a big part of Hitler's rise to power. And, there, as here, I think, spin propaganda is most effective when there's a desire and a willingness on the part of the public, or at least a significant part of the public, to believe it. And so I don't think you necessarily see a significant difference. I mean, I'm sure there are people who have studied this more thoroughly than I have, but I think and especially these days, there's so much kind of cross-fertilization. A lot of the American consultants go over and do business in Britain and so on, so there's traffic back and forth. Yes, sir.
At what point does spin become something much more insidious? For example, thinking of Ben Rhodes.
Yeah, I actually have a piece coming out soon in Politico that's sort of about lying in politics, and they include a sort of sidebar that's a sort of a taxonomy of different kinds of political lies, kind of ranging from what I call garden variety spin to, you know, the cover up, you know. So I agree. There's a range of severity and seriousness to the political rhetoric that's used. But it often, the way we judge that is by the consequences. And it tends to be the case, and this is sort of what I tried to suggest in my closing remarks, that when spin is put in the service of policies that we think are wrong, we tend to get quite outraged. So for a lot of people, this was for the Iraq War. For other people, might be for the Iran deal. Maybe for some people, it's for both those things. But when it tends to be, when it's in the service of causes that we believe in, we often applaud it, and perhaps we don't even see it as spin. So anyway, but as for the term, you know, I'm using the term in this kind of capacious way, the whole panoply of tools and techniques for image making and message craft. But obviously, sometimes people use spin in a much more dedicated way to mean deception. I have a little discussion in the book of why I think that's an overly narrow definition. Nancy? Yeah, well, in a way that gets into areas I haven't studied directly. I mean, as to sort of how the politics of referenda themselves play out when they're issue-based. But I think, from what I know of the research, the parties and often the individuals serve as proxies for the issues, and vice versa. Now, you may have seen with Brexit some of what we see here too this year, which is it's not just left against right, but it's populist against elitist, and that there are, you know, people from both camps, you know, it kind of cross cuts. So that may be, but still in general, you tended to see, you know, the right, you know, for leave and the center left for remain. Referenda, you know, are in a way where spin, it can be most egregiously on display, because it comes down to a single vote, and it's about, you know, getting a certain argument made by the election day, rather than, you know, in the course of a campaign for a healthcare bill or whatever. There's a daily ebb and flow, changing arguments. Well, the bill changes in response to that. You didn't have that with Brexit, so it kind of, you know, rigidified the issue positions. But often, I think typically they do tend to align. If you know, if you are, you know, an environmentalist, you are going to, you know, overwhelmingly support the Democrats, the liberals. If you are, you know, believe in, you know, the free market, you're overwhelmingly going to vote Republican. And it takes a lot to sort of disaggregate, separate the issue position from the candidate or the party that they are kind of in the conventional telling linked to.
In a way, reaches out across these distances to people, and in some cases,
Right. Yeah, that's a very insightful point. What I saw as a kind of recurring theme among a lot of these intellectuals, writers, critics that I talk about are key characters in the book. Those who, for one reason or another, take it as their mission to study persuasion, whether as academics, whether because they're in the advertising business. It's summed up best by Tony Schwartz, who was a Democratic advertising guy in the 60s and 70s. And he did, for example, the Daisy ad for Lyndon Johnson that shows the girl plucking the petals in a field of plucking petals. It's actually Black-Eyed Susan, I think, but it's called the Daisy ad. Counting up to 10, and then we hear a mission control voice counting down with a nuclear weapon. And the message says, vote Lyndon Johnson, the stakes are too high to stay at home. And it never once mentions the name of Barry Goldwater. But everyone took it to be a negative ad against Goldwater. Well, that's because for months before, all kinds of people, including Nelson Rockefeller, who ran against Goldwater for the Republican nomination, including a lot of journalists, highlighted other remarks Goldwater had made about let's lob one into the men's room in the Kremlin, or about using nukes as defoliants in Vietnam. So he had engaged in all this kind of reckless talk about nuclear weapons. So what Tony Schwartz says is the Daisy ad wasn't trying to persuade you of anything. It was trying to just bring to the fore things you already believed or thought. He talked about resonance and not persuasion as the way advertising or messaging work best. So again, it gets very hard to sort of wean people away from those core beliefs. There's one other quote that I like from Eric Hoffer, who wrote The True Believer, another one of these 1950s intellectuals. And I'm just going to see if I can find it here using the index, because I don't remember the quote verbatim, but I think I have it here on page 311. Hoffer wrote this. He wrote about mass movements and so on in The True Believer. He said, propaganda on its own cannot force its way into unwilling minds. Neither can it inculcate something wholly new, nor can it keep people persuaded once they have ceased to believe. Where opinion is not coerced, people can be made to believe only in what they already know. So, our predispositions count for so much here. And yes, of course, people can't change their mind. Evidence, argument. If everybody else around you is really saying, if you're a Republican and all your Republican friends are saying, well, I really can't vote for Trump, that will have an effect. But it takes a lot more than a 30-second TV ad. Yeah, Jim.
How widespread was the maintenance of a clipping file in a government agency, and is there an evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just first an aside, the notion of keeping it concealed, or sort of what, when they talk about propaganda, they call, I think, black propaganda. There's sort of black propaganda, gray propaganda. Part of the idea is if the provenance is concealed, like, if you know it's coming from a PR firm, you then discount for it. It's kind of like what I was saying before in response to a question. So if you assume this is authentic, organic, it will perhaps have more persuasive power. The clipping file, I really looked at it only for the White House, but it actually starts even before TR with McKinley. But it's a guy named George Cortelyou. He's another one of these like unsung heroes of the spin machine, who Cortelyou actually starts as the fourth assistant stenographer at the U.S. Postal Service, like working for the Postmaster General. He gets brought over in the Cleveland administration, works his way up to White House clerk, from stenographer then to White House secretary. And back then the White House staff was tiny. It was like a few people. So the secretary was the chief of staff, the press secretary, the scheduling secretary, all that rolled into one. And Cortelyou is a kind of paragon of progressive era efficiency mindedness. And he starts keeping, really for the Spanish-American War, I think it begins, or around that time, the clips for McKinley to monitor public opinion. Of course, there was no polling, so the newspapers are kind of the best gauge of public opinion that they could find. And I'm pretty sure that every president thereafter uses them. It starts to spread to other agencies. Starting with TR, you start getting PR people in different government agencies. By the New Deal, with this alphabet soup of all these new agencies that FDR introduces, there's all these angry articles, particularly from the right. It's interesting, when it's Republican presidents, it's liberal journalists who get worked up about government PR, and when it's Republican, when it's Democratic president, it's conservative journalists who get, so the conservatives get very worked up about Dr. Roosevelt's propaganda machine, and they talk about the government by publicity, and I don't know that they all had clipping services, but presumably by the 30s, it's a pretty widespread practice. But there probably is a history of the clipping service to be written. I don't know how much time we have. We take one more, okay? Yeah, thanks, Bay. That's a good question, and I don't want to spin myself or oversell my conclusions, right? So there's lots of times as I was writing the book, and especially during this election season, where I say, gee, how much trust should we really have in the capacity of a rational public to separate truth from fiction and so on? I often, when I give a book talk, get lots of questions about Trump, and I've taken to saying, well, we don't know how this movie ends, right? Which will say a lot. I think a lot of it is the system. It's not just that, I sort of trust in people, although I do to some degree, although I think people also have a capacity to lie and mislead. But I think that our system, because we do have, especially you look comparatively at most of the world and most other societies in history, one of the freest presses, in history, and we have a relatively competitive political system where neither of the two parties has ever been, dominant for, more than, say, 20 years or so, that there is this sort of continuing contest of ideas. And there are both within the government, Congress versus the presidency, within the two parties, within the media, enough opportunities for calling out deception and for counterspinning or unspinning that's at least available to the public. It doesn't mean that the public is always going to pick the best or the truest or the most sensible course, but we have available to us different narratives, different arguments that in a closed society, in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany or a lot of theocratic Islamist regimes just simply aren't available to the public, even in an age of social media, because those social media get shut down. So in some ways, the very availability of a diversity of argument is kind of the last resort. It's sort of the source of optimism, I think, for my vantage point, for that you say comes through from this book, which I am glad to hear it does.
Well, thank you for at least persuading me that there's a possibility.
Yeah, well, Nate Silver thinks there's a 77% probability that Trump loses. So, take that for what it is. Anyway, thank you all. I really appreciated talking to you today.